Chapter 3. Betrayal and Obedience. Samuel was quiet for a moment, and it appeared as if he had started talking to himself. They were more separated than united, he said, pointing at Cush. Let me say this. This United States we live in was divided in every aspect of the word. They were divided by the color of their skin, race, financial status, religion, and political parties. Back in the days, they had some fool running for president whose slogan was "Make America Great Again." Our people were asking, when was it great for us? The United States should have been called the Divided States of America, because even the division was divided, and that division, along with greed, caused its downfall. Cush looked at Samuel, and he laughed. Sorry, son, just thinking out loud. How fat people were at war with the skinny, dark-skinned versus light-skinned, rich versus the poor. Single mothers versus wives. But never mind that for now. Samuel leaned back in his chair and pointed at Cush. Lean back and rest, son, I've got a lot to tell. You. As he continued, this was before they made these bubbled cities, but it wasn't until King Joseph of Old Ireland became king that the word Wakatilians was first mentioned in modern history books. Now don't misunderstand, we got away from having authority figures like kings, queens, presidents, and all that during the Latronculian War, or some would call it World War III. Samuel waved his hands in the air carelessly, but old King Joseph was the great-great-grandson of someone who was of the so-called royal family back in the days, and he did something extra special to, or for the Abenians to reclaim that title. Anyways, Mr. King Joseph was just a simple Kompyutan, Samuel said with his fingers up to motion quotes, before saying, he had that special DNA, elite tier 1, shit, and thought he was number 1 and hated any type of authority other than his own. They also knew him as a cold-hearted, self-centered, arrogant, narcissistic, egotistical, and drunken whoremonger, and any other negative term you can find. Until he met Chi from the clan of Kamaria, it was often said that he wasn't the brightest light in the room, if you know what I mean. Cush said, No, I don't. Samuel shook his head. It means he wasn't too bright. But Chi, on the other hand, was a strong Wakatilian woman who demanded respect and never settled for anything less. She was the total opposite of her oldest sister, Ella, a concubine slave by choice, who was already in King Joseph's palace. She was the Queen of Ireland for 3 years, give or take a couple of months, when she was murdered as the first wife of King Joseph and given the title of Greatest Maiden Peer of Old Ireland. Samuel became animated. Cush laughed at Samuel, as he talked in a European dialect, and Samuel smiled back at him. You see, in ancient England they had a system whereby your inheritance gave you a special position. This inheritance classified you as being royalty, and King Joseph adopted this same system when he came into power. Samuel scratched his head. Or was it his father? Anyways, King Joseph is the one who married our ancestor. They brought back this system, but it died before King Joseph's death. However, their marriage and her execution made her a historical figure in the first political and religious upheaval that led to the Kompyutans' separation from Abenian authority and rule. She was the daughter of Shaka and his wife Lizzie. Lizzie was from Southern Ireland, a proud descendant of the Twa tribe. Chi wasn't her real name. Her real name was Anaya, but everyone called her Chi for future references. You can call her Queen Anaya, the first. We'll get to the other two later. Samuel paused. You see, back then, the Abenians, hell everyone, saw Wakatilians as inferior and as nothing more than property. So, you can imagine how they felt about Queen Chi, a Wakatilian woman who was now married to their king. Things were never easy for Queen Chi. She had to endure countless attempts on her life, including an assassination attempt by her own sister Ella. Queen Chi had to be vigilant and on her toes at all times, but despite all the dangers and difficulties, she remained a strong and influential leader. Cush listened intently to Samuel's story, fascinated by the rich history and the struggles that his ancestor had endured. As Samuel continued his tale, Cush felt a deep sense of pride in his heritage and the legacy of his people. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but he was inspired by the resilience and determination of his people, and he was ready to carry on their legacy of unity and equality for all people. Samuel pulled out his footstool and rested his legs. The story goes that King Joseph often made trips to southern Ireland to replenish his cabinets with fresh fruits, herbs, homemade beers, and fine liquors. There, he met Chi and fell madly in love with her, not caring that she was Wakatilian. Because, as always, it was against the law to marry one. He could have had her as a slave, but he wanted her love. So, he began pursuing her, but she resisted his attempts to seduce her, and she definitely refused to be anyone's concubine, because her dreams were to become an influential leader of her people. She rejected all his advancements, and respectfully confronted the king. It soon became the one object of King Joseph's desire to change his whoremonger ways. To marry Chi. Samuel paused. "Let me stop right there. You can't make a hoe into a housewife. In this case, a husband, for she knew who he was, but ignored the signs. He had already been with her sister. But anyway, I guess she thought he would change. Hell, I don't know. We would have to ask her. Plus, Sabaoth had his hand in the decision, or else you and I wouldn't be here." However, when it became clear to the Abenian Alpha 23, an elite Abenian who governs this section of the world, that King Joseph was trying to marry a Wakatilian, all hell broke loose. He demanded that their engagement end, or else they would separate themselves from the people of Old Ireland, leaving them to fend for themselves. This threat didn't sit too well with the king, and out of drunken anger and contempt toward the Abenians, King Joseph married Chi, made her queen, and granted her the title of the greatest of the great maiden of Old Ireland. Shortly afterward, Abenian Alpha 23 decreed sentences of excommunication against King Joseph and his entire territory. Because of this marriage and these excommunications, they officially broke off their ties with the Irish Kompyutans. After being crowned Queen Chi of Old Ireland, she gave birth to Queen Anaya, the first, almost a year later. Back then, men always wanted their firstborn to be boys, and her gender disappointed him. It did not entirely discourage him, for he said a son would surely follow and professed to love his daughter Anaya. Once the royal baby was born, Queen Abelin, King Joseph's mother, along with governors and generals of each Commonwealth nation, was informed along with the rest of the royal family, and Chi's family as well. Many despised the so-called taboo or abomination, but feared the wrath of the king. But there was chaos in the streets, by this time, because the people started feeling the effects of not having the Abenians' technology, or its advantages. Samuel stopped for a moment. "Billy, can you explain this silly-ass birth ceremony?" Billy then said, "Why is it silly? These were their customs and practices. They probably think that your Sabaoth is a fairy tale, and they do. But sure. According to their customs, a royal physician signs an official document confirming the newborn's gender, weight, and birth time. A palace official will bring this document out of the hospital, and this is the first sign the world will get that the royal baby has arrived. And it's then handed to a messenger who will take it to the palace under guard. They put the notice into a frame at the palace, positioned on an easel and placed in the palace forecourt, at which time the world will know the gender of the baby. However, it could take anywhere from up to 8 days before the new arrival's name is announced. After the announcement, a brief statement by the king of the child's birth outside the hospital." Samuel interrupted Billy. "You know, you're probably right about your statement you just made. But I know what I know, seen what I know, and felt what I know about Sabaoth. It's what they know, so I will take my statement back, about it being silly. It's their traditions. Traditions of men handed down for generations. Anyways, thanks, I got it from here," Billy said. "You're welcome." Samuel continues. At the hospital, the king made his announcement of the child. Although they were at the ceremony, Chi's parents were supposed to be up there with the royal family. But because they were Wakatilians, they were standing in the back of the crowd. They minted 5,000 silver pennies to mark the royal birth. Samuel pulled a silver penny out of his pocket and handed it to Cush. Like this one. The king's artillery sounded celebratory gun salutes in the royal park with 41-round salute, and again by the honorable artillery at the Tower of Ireland with a 62-round salute. In keeping with their traditions, it is said that when she left the royal hospital, they burned her sheets, because she was Wakatilian. She appeared on the steps of the building with her newborn as the crowd looked on. The ceremony lasted for 2 days before Chi's family was to head back home. Chi's father, Shaka, approached her with tears in his eyes. "I will return in 8 months to take the baby and perform my family ceremonies in the Holy of Holies. Don't let anyone know, not even your Uncle Mal. Do not let them know where the baby or I am. Because it is of great, great importance to Sabaoth that no one knows her whereabouts. You will find out why I have asked of you such requests later. I also need all royal documents of her birth and 500 silver pennies." She smiled. "It is so." After 8 months, Shaka showed up at the palace, and with open arms she had everything he asked for. He didn't stay there long enough to see the king, and she never saw her daughter again. 3. Miscarriages followed, and King Joseph returned to his old ways of having orgies and entertaining other women. The king's love for Chi was gone, and so was his loyalty to her. I also heard, not once did he ask about his daughter, Anaya. Shaking his head, Samuel repeated himself. Not once. By this time, the full effects of the Abenians' absence caused civil unrest and violence that took over the land. Soon after, she was taken and charged with high treason and sent to the highest court in Ireland by her accusers. She was tried before a jury of peers, including her former betrothed and her Uncle Mal. Like I told you before, everyone who is your family ain't your family. The court proceedings were long and intense, with both sides presenting their arguments and evidence. In the end, Queen Chi was found guilty of high treason, adultery, inciting a coup, witchcraft, and a bunch of other lies according to old Ireland laws, and sentenced to life imprisonment in a remote dungeon in the mountains. King Joseph didn't give a damn by the verdict, and didn't even try to appeal to the Abenians for clemency. However, the king's reputation was tarnished, and he lost much of his support among the people of old Ireland. Again, he didn't care. After a formal lackluster apology in front of the citizens with all the balloons and whistles by King Joseph, old Ireland was punished for their sins, but eventually united with the Abenians once again. To show the Abenians their loyalty, Chi's charges were upgraded and she was beheaded days later. Cush had forgotten he held the silver penny in his hand as he handed it back to Samuel. "Wow, these Abenians sure do hate us." "But why?" Samuel said. "Yes, they do. You will find out. Just wait. Remember, like always, and I'll say it again, history repeats itself." Martha interrupted them when she entered the living room with some fresh squeezed lemonade. "Here, old man, y'all gone need something to drink with all that talking y'all doing?" Samuel smiled. "Thanks, I sure do." Taking a drink, Samuel smacked his lips as Martha handed Cush a glass. Samuel continued, "This rang true for the Wakatilians of Ireland." He paused. "Martha, this here lemonade is something else." Martha smiled. "Thanks, babe." Samuel continued as he smacked his lips again. "Like I said, this rang true for the Wakatilians of Ireland, and the life in Ireland was cruel toward the Wakatilians. For the next 200 years after Chi's death, the Abenians took revenge on the Wakatilians because of what she had done. The silver pennies were thrown out, but the Wakatilians found them and kept them for themselves. It was so bad that they started immigrating to the Americas as a way to get out. But even that wasn't a joyful event. Because they were Wakatilians, they could not travel the way the Kompyutans did. And on top of that, the Kompyutans started spreading rumors that they carried contagious diseases. Kompyutans hired desperate Anakataas to ship them on old rusty naval ships as indentured servants to the Americas for the price of 1 year of servitude. As it showed lucratively, the cost increased every year as these immigrants rushed to get out of the country. The first servants imported into the Americas were just a few hundred Wakatilians promising to send for their relatives afterward. They referred to these laborers as servants, not as slaves, because many agreed to work for land and rights. Little did they know, it was just empty promises and straight-up lies. Samuel continued. Indentured servants were slaves as it has always been since the 1600s. And let's not forget what happened to Libya after the murder of Muammar al-Gaddafi. Slavery applies to any person bought and sold, chained and abused, whether for a year, a decade, or a lifetime. Over the years, many Wakatilians died long before their indentured services ended. Those who did make it were denied their freedom. Do you think the justice system would have helped them? There was no justice system, no court of law, just 10-1. Who would back them when their owners failed to deliver on their promises? The Abenians? I don't think so. Millions of so-called convicts, beggars, homeless, and other undesirable Wakatilians were transported to the Americas against their will on slave ships. Once that money got good to the Anakataas, it was a free-for-all. Those slaves who volunteered did so only because they knew their future in Ireland would be more poverty, disease, and oppression. From the Kompyutans and the Abenians because of Chi or Anaya, the first. They were stuck on an island with nowhere to go. America became their dream. These ships were a repeat of the trans-American slave trade. They were so crowded and in terrible conditions that many died on their way to the Americas. Even as the ships were docking, they soon learned that living in America would be a battle for survival. Thousands of runners, usually large groups of greedy men, swarmed aboard the ship before they could dock, grabbing them and forcing them to tenement houses. They then would charge an outrageous fee for their services. Some of them had to settle in the ports they arrived in, begging on every street corner. Samuel paused as he finished his lemonade. Unfamiliar with plumbing and running water, let alone technology. These living conditions bred sickness and premature death. They estimated that 75% of all infants born to the Irish Wakatilians immigrants died. They were ridiculed for how they dressed, for being poor and illiterate. Instead of apologizing for themselves, they soon united and took offense. They often met insult or intimidation with violence. Solidarity was their strength. They helped one another survive this life. They prayed and drank together. The men seemed to do more drinking than praying, yet their faith and determination led them to create the Sabaoth First Temple of the Americas. It was a militant church, a church that fought not only for their souls, but also for their human rights. During this time, one of the greatest Wakatilians came on the scene, Abooksigun, which means wildcat, from the clan of Tablita, the son of Wanyenyekevu and Queen Anaya, the first. Your grandfather, the man from the other side of nowhere, some called him. Cush looked at Samuel. The other side of nowhere? Samuel just smiled. I will get into that later, just know he was a young man, a few years older than you, when he arrived. But he grew into a man of significant influence who became the reasoning force between all Wakatilians in those parts. They united and destroyed one of the evilest Abenian demon there, Batet. He understood that the Kompyutans and the Abenians were the enemies. They were trying to force our people to destroy one another because of geographical locations, faith, skin color and tones, and other idiotic reasons, and Abooksigun wanted all Wakatilians, Anakataas, and even Kompyutans united as one. He even saved a few Kompyutans in the process. Abooksigun was our ancestor, who was born in Arizona. He knew firsthand about the separation and destruction of Wakatilians because his father, Wanyenyekevu, taught him about his history and different cultures as a whole. Being the son of Queen Anaya, the first who was half Kompyutan and half Wakatilian, they nicknamed them many names like half-breed and a few others, but they called themselves Mestizos. and that's how that name came to be. The Mestizos were a unified force. That was an exceptional group of people who were well trained in the art of war created by Sabaoth himself, called Poing de Dia or Hands of God, but he was also well trained in the art of peace. By this time, many Mestizos were very well respected and feared in the West. The Mestizos were created when Chi's father, Shaka, was visited by a servant of Sabaoth a few months before Chi's death named Mletsi. Cush interrupted Samuel before he could finish. "Dandaddy?" Samuel said. "Yes, son, the same one." Cush asks, "How old is he?" Samuel said, "When Sabaoth said, 'Let us create man in our image'." It was Mletsi and Shika he was speaking to. Cush leaned back in his chair as Samuel continued. Mletsi told Shaka to send Anaya to the Americas right before her mother's death to his brother's land, where she later married Wanyenyekevu. However, it was told to her uncle Mal that a renegade Abenian murdered her, as they obeyed the word of Sabaoth. Shaka didn't go himself, but sent his bravest warriors to a reservation in the far western part of the Americas in the old town of Tucson, Arizona. It was there she would meet Wanyenyekevu, a Wakatilian warrior, a Louisiana prince who came to Arizona seeking the power and glory of Sabaoth. Samuel continued with his story, telling Cush about how the Wakatilians eventually formed their own nations, and each nation separated into clans and refused the term Wakatilians. The nations were founded on the principles of unity, equality, and justice for all its people, regardless of their background. The nations thrived and prospered, and it became a beacon of hope and inspiration for all oppressed people around the world. Samuel looked at Cush and saw that his eyes were becoming heavy. "That's enough for today, and I've gotten off track. Anyways, go get you some rest, and we will continue tomorrow." Cush got up early the following day and did his chores around the house hastily, rushing to get to his grandfather's house. He skipped breakfast, because he knew Big Ma always prepared a feast whenever she cooked. He ran to his grandfather's house less than a quarter of a mile, until he saw the front door. There was a 6-foot-high fence that ran along the pathway. He saw Gemini standing there staring at him, smiling and waving. "Good morning, Gemini!" The horse stomped his hoofs into the ground and shook his head. Cush was excited and smiled as he got closer to his grandfather's door. Samuel's stories were so vivid and clear to Cush, as if he could see the characters in real life and in real time. Knocking on the door, he was met by his little cousins, Cliff, nicknamed Sweets, and Ron, whose nickname was Baby Bruh. Cliff was 5 years old, and the oldest of the two brothers, but wherever you saw Cliff, you saw Ron running behind him. Cliff had the door cracked open and a delicious aroma came rushing out that had Cush's mouth watering. Ron throws open the door the rest of the way, standing in the middle of the doorway, half-dressed. "What you want?" said Ron, blocking Cush from entering the house. "It's Cush!" shouted Cliff. "Little boy, get in here with no clothes on." It was Mama Sook, Big Ma's best friend, grabbing Ron by the hand and moved him out of the way. "Good morning, Mama Sook," Cush said. Mama Sook smiled. "Good morning, child." A loud voice came out of the kitchen. "Sweets! What I done told you about opening that there door. Sook, bring that naked-ass boy here. I'm so tired of telling that boy the same thing." Hearing Big Ma's voice in a stern voice. "Who's at that door, this time of the morning?" Cush shouts. "Morning, Big Ma, it's me." Recognizing his voice, Big Ma shouts. "Oh, hey Cush, I forgot you and Samuel were talking. Get Baby Bruh, and you and Sweets come on in and wash up. Breakfast will be ready in about 10 minutes. Samuel was at the table drinking coffee and listening to some recordings. He paused the recording. "Good morning, Cush." Cush smiled. "Morning, Dandaddy." Samuel smiled back. "Sit down and drink a cup of coffee with me." Big Ma overheard the conversation. "Samuel, don't you give that boy no coffee. He'll be running around here like a chicken with its head cut off." Samuel winked at Cush. "Hush yo fuss, bae, I ain't gonna give that boy no coffee. as he secretly poured a little coffee in his saucer and passed it to Cush, saying, "A little coffee ain't never hurt nobody." Samuel smiled at Cush as he called out, "Baby bruh, come here." Ron came running in. Samuel took a long drag from his favorite King Edward cigar that was resting in an ashtray and blowing the smoke into Ron's hair. "Your hair is on fire, baby bruh, look," Samuel said as he showed Ron a small mirror. Ron ran out screaming and laughing. Big Ma then yelled out, "Y'all come get some teat," a word used in these parts that meant something to eat. As soon as she spoke those words, the entire house seemed to shake as a crowd from out of nowhere came rushing in from every direction. The youngest sat on the floor with their back against the cabinet, making a path for people to pass through. The oldest sat at the table, and Samuel walked out as Big Ma handed him a plate. "Go get your plate and meet me in my study," Samuel told Cush. Samuel pulls out a stand for Cush to eat on, and Cush placed his plate on the stand and they said grace. Cush looked at his plate and didn't know where to start. Eggs, bacon, deer sausages, grits, homemade biscuits, and a glass of fresh squeezed orange juice. The entire house was quiet. All one could hear was the sound of spoons and forks hitting the plates and glasses being placed back on the tables or floor. After they ate, Samuel gave Cush his plate. "Take these to the kitchen, tell your grandmother, thanks, and hurry back." Cush rushed back and took a seat in Samuel's favorite chair as Samuel sat on the small love seat talking for a bit as everyone had chores to do, from the youngest to the oldest. Their duties included washing the dishes, cleaning the garden, feeding the animals, and washing clothes. The eldest homeschooled the youngest, then Cush said nervously, "Dan, Daddy, I have that poem for you." Samuel looked up at Cush. "You just now telling me?" "Well, go ahead." Cush smiled. "I was waiting for my cousins to get gone." Cush cleared his throat. "Got this strange feeling. It feels as if many folks think that God is some big old giant white man, sitting on a throne. That alone is a hoax, for he is spirit and truth. You got him judging your every move, a heartless man, who calls himself God, that calls himself love. My God searches the heart. My God cradles his love for you. What is the true definition of love? What lie is this? That you've been told. Who told you these lies? That many don't believe in God. No, they don't believe in him because of this. I got some good news for you. That's not the truth for you. Close your eyes. Do it right now. Close your eyes. Go back in time. When you went over to see Granddaddy, Papa Joe, or Old Man Hamp. You know his name, you know their names, your grandfather. God is like your grandfather. God is like Granddaddy, Papa Joe, and Old Man Hamp. He loves you, and you feel his love. It's not artificial or GMO. He'll tell you, watch yourself. Be careful, he'll tell you the truth about yourself, unlike no one else. He'll tell you, I wouldn't do that if I were you. Or simply, no. If we listen to his voice, of course, God is like your grandfather. The girls get special privileges and treated like queens, you know what I mean. The boys get to do things that the girls can't do, and neither mother nor father has a word to say. Your grandfather is talking, and they are listening. God is like a grandfather. You feel the love, you feel the pain from the punishments that you gain. Your grandfather is a good example. It is as plain as can be. Easy for you to see what God's love is meant to be. 'Cause God is like your grandfather.